15.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for inviting me here this evening. I'm going to tell you a story tonight about the one part of the human body that is freighted with more meaning than any other, our hearts. And with that in mind, I'd like you just to take a moment to palpate your radial pulse as a doctor would. So, left hand, which I can't extend, but extend your left hand, and then take the two fingertips of your right hand, feel the bone just beneath your thumb, your radius there, move inwards about 1 centimetre, and I hope you can all feel a nice, strong, regular pulse there in your radial artery, because if you haven't, I don't really want to interrupt my talk for you, if that's okay. That blood that you can feel in your wrist has just been pumped by your heart into your aorta at such pressures that if the aorta was severed, it would spurt vertically upwards about 5 meters into the roof of the tabernacle. And your pulse, your heartbeat, is incredibly, exquisitely sensitive to your emotions. So if, for instance, you have been surreptitiously fancying someone you shouldn't on your table, then your pulse may have quickened this evening. Or if you've drunk rather a lot of wine this evening, and I'm not looking at you, Professor Spiegelhalter, it may be a little slow and sluggish. And this is one of the reasons why, in the English language, the way we refer to our heart is so incredibly rich in metaphor. Our hearts, for example, soar or swoop or break or burn. They have a particular size. We might be big-hearted or small-hearted. They have a temperature, hot or cold. And they take many material forms. So your heart may be hewn from oak if you are a courageous person, or your heart may be cast from gold if you're very magnanimous, or it may be poured forth in liquid form if you confide your deepest secrets to someone you trust in a heart-to-heart. And the Oxford English Dictionary definition of the word heart runs to an incredible 15,000 words, which just speaks to this gorgeous complexity of language around this organ. It's also the case that for most of human history, doctors, surgeons haven't dared go anywhere near the heart. And in one sense, that's obviously very understandable. The heart is in perpetual motion. It's always beating. Of course you don't want to attempt to go near it with a scalpel, but there's also an act of immense hubris involved in cutting into an organ which from Aristotle onwards has been defined as the seat of the human soul. Now, we are all familiar with the idea that it's the brain, not the heart, where our selves, our emotions, our morals, our values lie. But it's still very, very hard not to think of our heart as the place we inhabit. I became a medical student 20 years ago, and really ever since then, I've been fascinated by the history of how my profession, doctors, surgeons, went from that point of fear vis-a-vis the heart to one in which not only did they start to operate on the heart, they also committed this outlandish, almost science fiction-esque act of transplanting a human heart. So if you think for a moment what that entails, you have to still it, first of all. You have to inject a beating heart with drugs to still it. You have to cut it out of a chest. You have to pack it in ice, put it in a cooler box, send it hundreds, maybe thousands of miles to another part of the country. In America, every year, hearts are literally put in the hold like luggage and sometimes end up trapped there, and somebody at the other end doesn't get their transplant because of a American Airlines failure. Don't sue me. It's an extraordinary thing to contemplate, not to mention then the surgical pyrotechnics that take place at the other end to stitch this ice-cold organ into a human being laid out on the table in front of you. If you are interested in the history of this evolution, it is really spectacular. It is filled with larger-than-life characters. We've heard very beautifully from Beatrice about the moon landings, the consequence of the space race. Well, there were two big races going on in the 1960s, that one, and also the race to be the first surgeon to achieve a human heart transplant. And in many ways, the patients on whom surgeons globally were experimenting, and I'm afraid it really wasn't much more often than an experiment, they were very much like the moon, as in they were territory to be conquered by these daring-do, maverick surgeons, full of ambition, willing to take risks, and always, but always, possessing an immense amount of machismo. They were all men. Women couldn't possibly undertake such dangerous work. So I was fascinated by this story. But for me always, as a student and then as a young doctor, the thing that interested me most of all actually wasn't the surgical egos, it was the territory on which their scalpels laid waste, by which I mean the ordinary human beings and their families. And in 2016, I came across an extraordinary human story that just stopped me in my tracks, and it involves these two children. So at the top there, that is little Kira Ball, and down here, Max Johnson. So these two children, their lives would end up becoming entwined around a single shared heart. They would go on to change legal history in the UK. And even today, right now, these children are saving lives because of what they achieved. And theirs is the story that I decided to tell in my new book, weaving the incredible historical story around what happened to them. So here on the left, you can see Max at the point at which he was healthy for the last time. After this point, he's 8 years old. His health started to inexplicably fail. He became weak and breathless and skinny, and his GP diagnosed asthma. Inhalers didn't work, and then eventually, suddenly, as children tend to do, he crashed and was rushed into hospital and diagnosed with a condition called dilated cardiomyopathy. His heart was so swollen it filled up almost the entirety of his chest. He was perilously unwell. His parents were given the following statistic. Max has a 30% chance of survival, a 30% chance of needing a heart transplant, and a 30% chance of dying. So suddenly, his parents' lives overturned. And from that point onwards, for the next 9 months, Max was in hospital waiting and waiting and waiting for a heart, getting sicker and sicker and sicker. Eventually, tragically, in the summer of 2017, Kira, who you can see there, 9 years old, was in a fatal car crash with her family. And her injuries, she suffered catastrophic head injuries, left her brain dead. Her family immediately made the decision to donate her organs. She was an incredibly kind little girl, and they knew that's what she would have wanted. And so Kira's heart went to Max and saved his life. Now, normally that would be the end of the story. In Britain, for very obvious reasons, donor and recipient families do not tend to meet. There are all kinds of emotional complexities around that. But in this case, something unusual had happened. Max had ended up appearing on the front page of the Mirror newspaper. That was where I came across his story. His parents were desperate. They knew he was likely to die almost any time. He was sick enough to die at any time. And at this time, in 2017, a campaign was underway to change the law around organ donation to one of assumed consent rather than assumed opt-out. And Max's parents agreed for him to feature in an article. The Mirror was campaigning on this issue to try and promote awareness and pressure the government. So I saw a picture of Max looking as ethereal and pallid and thin and desperately, desperately unwell as you could imagine. And then miraculously, a couple of months later, there he was again on the front page of the Mirror. But now he was pink and vivacious and just sparking with life, as every 9-year-old should. Then the amazing thing happened. Because of the publicity, Kira's mum worked out that her daughter's heart must have gone to Max. And living as we do in the age of social media, she made contact with Emma, Max's mum. And she wrote the following message. She said, "I think your son may have our daughter's heart, and it's the most beautiful heart in the world." And that was the start of a relationship between both families, initially online, and then finally they met in person, and the meeting was documented again by the Mirror. And when I read this front page story, I started to cry as soon as I read it. The family went to visit Max's family, and one by one, Kira's mother, father, brother, and 2 sisters listened with a stethoscope to the heart of Kira inside the chest of the little boy whose life she had saved. An extraordinary thing. Tentatively, I got in touch with both families, and over the last 5 years built up a relationship with them and interviewed all of the medical professionals who were involved in this extraordinary story of Kira's heart from one human chest to another. And I'm going to share just one example of that story. So, hearts are typically, we think of them as one of 3 things which end simultaneously when we die. So, again, for most of human history, if your heart stops, 2 things happen very quickly afterwards. Your lungs will stop breathing, and your brain will stop working. That happens because your heart is no longer pumping oxygen around the body. Likewise, if your brain stops functioning, it's not sending signals to your heart or your lungs to work, so everything stops simultaneously. And again, likewise, if your lungs stop working, the other 2 stop. Actually, in Victorian England, people noticed that sometimes when they fished some poor specimen out of the Thames after they'd thrown themselves off a bridge, you could sometimes revive them, and that led to the practice of putting bellows at various intervals along the edge of the Thames, so that if someone ended up in such extremis, you could attempt to save their life by pumping air up the back passage, the hope being that this would reinflate the lungs and save their life, thus coining the phrase to blow air, hot air, up somebody's arse. It's a true story, and indeed it did work, but I suspect more from the trauma of that experience than anything physiological. When ventilators were invented in the 1950s, that changed. Suddenly, with a ventilator, we were able to have somebody whose brain was completely dead and yet whose heart could keep beating because we, doctors, were now artificially inflating their lungs and making their lungs work. And suddenly it was possible to have a state of being where you were dead, there was no activity in your brain at all, and yet you looked alive. You looked as though you were simply sleeping. That is the state in which Kira and her family found themselves in intensive care. She looked like a beautiful sleeping little girl who was going to wake up and open her eyes, and her family had to accept the fact that nevertheless her brain had stopped working and she could never, ever open her eyes again. I think it's truly, truly exceptional that in circumstances as harrowing and devastating as that, a family found it within themselves to look beyond their grief and say, we want to give, we want to look outwards, and as an act of altruism, we want to share these organs so that other children, other families may live. It's easy to forget in this world of ours quite how good and strong and decent and courageous and altruistic most people are when it comes to the crunch, and boy, is that an example of it. I'm conscious of running out of time. I'd love to share some stories of Christian Barnard, but I'm afraid that you'll have to buy the book for that. I want to end now with Max and Kira's words. So first of all, Kira's. She died in the summer holidays, and in the last week of school, her primary school teacher asked everybody in the class to write a letter to themselves that they would open and read in the first week of the new term in the autumn. And Kira wrote this: "Dear Kira, over the next year, I'd like to get better at writing, get better at looking after animals, get better at English. I will do my best to achieve them. Kira." And of course, that letter was delivered to her parents in the autumn term. And here are Max's words now. So Max is now, there he is just after his surgery, and there he is today. He's a 6 foot tall, gangling 16-year-old, beautifully vivacious, absolutely wonderful. I took that photo 2 weeks ago, and he has recorded a message that sums up how he's feeling now. Before I play this, please note, this happens to be Organ Donation Week. Please, please, if you take one thing from tonight, I don't care about you buying my book. I don't care that my editor's in the audience. I want you to sign up to the organ donation register and tell your loved ones your views about organ donation, and ask your loved ones, please ask your kids. Children are dying in the UK every year for want of an organ. Ask your kids how they feel. And I'll finish by handing you over to Max.
I'm 16 now, and I've had my heart for 7 years, and I'm feeling absolutely amazing. I've picked up fishing, which is amazing to get outside and, enjoy fresh air. I do some stuff in the gym to keep my heart healthy and in general. And I also do some mixed martial arts, which is also a good way to have fun and keep fit. When I think about Kira's family, all I can think about is how incredible they are and what their decision did to my life, and how if they didn't say yes, who knows where I'd be, And because of that decision, I'm here and alive and enjoying life. So yeah.